Hello, everybody. This week we're looking at global inequality, and as compared to last week, we looked more at class and caste, and we're going to apply that now to the larger scope of how the global systems and how sociologists look at the global systems of how we do economy. Um, the quote of the day comes from Emanuel Wallerstein. He is one of our most famous sociologist that's still living, not a dead guy, so that's really good to know. He says, people resist exploitation. They resist as actively as they can, as passively as they must. And what he's explaining here is that there are levels where we've stratified, and we, for example, will hear about workers around the globe making cents for hours of work, maybe 5 cents a day or 10 cents a day. And comparatively, they are being exploited. If we were doing the same labor in the US, it would be much more. But there's a whole system that we're looking at there as well. For some, this might be the only work they can get. And so that level of exploitation is something they're willing to take on because it's better than not being able to have a job at all. However, as we see the gap start to rise, we see much difficulty in how that trade and how that is fairly enacted. So this week we're going to look at the effects of globalization. And globalization is the development of social and economic relationships stretching worldwide. Believe it or not, this didn't always happen. Think about the fact that we haven't circumlocated the whole world. We have not been around the world as a regular norm for most of humanity's existence. Just that whole idea of trade seems so normal to us. But it was more localized for the largest majority of human existence on the planet. And so as we start to see nation states interact with each other, we see that the world systems emerge, and you start to see the same kind of stratification that you see in your own local economy. Therefore, global inequality, which is different than globalization, is that difference in wealth and power among countries, and we see a huge amount of difference. Again, there are some videos that are uploaded this week, and go ahead and take your time to look through those. I'm also, by the way, extending the response time this week, so I will make sure to have that in the announcement. One way we look at our sense of comparison is through what we call gross national income. And there's other levels of measurement. For example, gross GDP, gross domestic product, is something you'll hear if you're an economist, how much you produce as a country. This is based on actually what you make divided by the whole population, the services, the goods, all of that. By the total population, then divided by the population. This is the simple term for that, to see per dollar how that lands in each community or in each nation state. There's a lot of issues when it comes to gross national income. It doesn't always paint a picture of how people are truly living. Some people, if you do a divide like this, it's like doing an average. I often recommend doing a median. It's more important, I think, to know how many people are living above a certain number and how many are living below. And so median serves better, but this tends to still be something that people use to compare the wealth of a country. And so we look at these through what we call high income, low income, and middle income countries, just like we do with class. This isn't, by the way, something that every nation state agrees on. And so this is often a very westernized principle. But we see World Trade organizations and the IMF and all of these different organizations that basically try to agree on these standards. The high-income countries are $12,616 and higher annual income per person. Once again, thinking about the total income from all of those goods made. So this is gross national income, and then divided by population. So that would be the U.S. Our average income is well above $12,616 based on this scale. Middle income countries are 4,086 to 12,615 annual income per person, and then lower middle income countries is 1,036 to 4,085. Now, just like we saw in the video last week about the wage cap, is that sometimes the difference between income and wealth, just because people are bringing this much in, doesn't necessarily mean they have wealth or can survive disasters. I want you to think about the tsunamis and the earthquakes and the fires, the infrastructures of certain countries. They're not able to bounce back the same way. And so that can have much higher impact on people if they don't have that infrastructure, even if they are making an income that looks like it could be subsistence at least. It doesn't necessarily transfer wealth. And so that's a thing to keep in mind as we're talking about this. So high income countries are usually industrialized: United States, Canada, England, China, Japan. Those are the ones that we often call our core countries. We see places where development is happening with higher industrialization, obviously the USSR. We see large portions of Germany and the Netherlands and any of the Scandinavian countries. I mean, there's large places where you see higher income, highly industrialized sites. This makes up 14.2% of the world's population in 2012. That's 66% of the world's income, though, is in these countries. And so, just like we saw with class, you see a higher level of income going into a smaller group of people. Middle income countries, both upper and lower, just like we talked about with class, are usually East and Southeast Asia. We think of places like Thailand that was just hit quite devastatingly with the tsunami, the earthquake, all at once, that will totally devastate their economy for quite a long time, especially with a lot of the infrastructure. But there's a lot of times we're invested. That is a place where there's high production. So a lot of times you'll see companies be able to get back on their feet because they have some sort of industrialization going on, but just not as high levels. The Middle East, North Africa, and Mexico. Mexico, again, it depends on what we're seeing with the level of trade that's going on and if companies stay or do not stay within the country to provide work. And so this is 71.7% of the world's population. This is a large portion. This is where the largest group of our people tend to live. And it's a mix between that upper and lower income, 30.7% of the world's wealth. And then the low-income countries are Eastern, Western, and Sub-Saharan Africa, Cambodia, North Korea, Haiti. These are the places that you think of that when they are hit with some sort of a major disaster, their recovery is so slow, and their ability to get electricity and get all kinds of things as far as their infrastructure back up and running, it's just sometimes nearly impossible to do, even if that infrastructure was ever there. So 12% of the world's population, and they only produce 0.7% of the world's wealth, and that is a meager amount. So you're not seeing large portions of people and companies, industries, other nation states trying to develop these countries as well. So it becomes a major problem. Low-income countries, less than 1,036 per annual income, is 5% of the world's population. And so again, if we were looking at those equal distributions of 100 people, at the world's population, about 5% are in that low-income country region. There are 4 types of theories that I want you to know about that are really important for your quiz and also your exam. Market-oriented theories, dependency, world systems, and state-centered theories. We're going to focus on those. First, market-oriented theories. This is what we're usually used to. This is what the U.S. and capitalist countries and nation states work off of. It's economic in nature. It assumes the best possible consequences will result if individuals are free to make their own economic decisions. And it often uses this word, progress. Now, the interesting thing is, like looking at class studies, if you start off in a major disadvantage, progress is not going to be as easy to attain. And there are sometimes things that have been put into place. So as nation states develop, they can't necessarily develop off of other nation states' models as easily because they started off with different resources, different levels of education, all kinds of factors that come into play with this. And it typically in market driven, it's very functionalist and performance. If you do this, then this will happen, and then you can move to this. That doesn't often take into account all the different factors that come into play. And especially the very first one is even to get the very first stage, which we'll talk about, the stages of development are often talked about. To get that first stage to happen for some countries is just impossible, especially if they have no allies or anybody investing in them. So these often will be built around modernization theory, which says it argues that low-income countries can develop economically if they give up traditional ways. And this was the model after World War II that was basically delivered and sold to most countries. There was a meeting after World War II. Bretton Woods was up, I believe, in Massachusetts. And most of the world's leaders came after World War II that were part of the Allied and also Germany and others that were represented in a way to try and create the next setup, what we're going to do after World War II. The Marshall Plan, went into effect as well, which, by the way, did not have Germany basically pay, or Japan pay for their reconstruction. Actually, the U.S. and other countries, UK, invested in rebuilding these countries so that the global systems could head towards a capitalist market economy and actually be more conducive. And in a lot of ways, that's where we started to see the development of the Cold War, because it was that theory of modernizing and democracy being a major part of that, and capitalism being the key to making that work. So W.W. Rostow is the key theorist that brought up this idea of the 4 stages, thinking that there was a traditional stage that a country could go through, a takeoff, a drive to maturity, and a high mass consumption, which is the end goal, which in our day and age, we've seen a lot of high mass consumption, and it can develop, but if you're addicted to mass consumption as your way of gaining your surplus value, there may be some major issues that things like the environment, things like, once again, exploitation of workers to get more surplus value from the corporations, and also the wealthy. A lot of times aren't the best fair players when it comes to that. These 4 stages look like this. The traditional stage is where the country usually is if they haven't already been developing. And if these countries, this is the idea behind this. Once again, I don't necessarily agree with this idea. I think a lot of people take issue with it. But usually you find this in low-income countries where the governments are unstable, the institutions don't have an infrastructure, and there's a lack of work ethic, supposedly. Now, the interesting thing is that idea of a work ethic is in symbolic interactionalism. The idea of what we believe work is heavily biased towards a culture. We've seen a lot of places where if you don't work a solid 12 hours in a row without a break, that can look income and wealth-wise like you are just, at the highest level of modernity. However, we see larger amounts of heart attacks, mental health issues, divorce, families not being able to sustain themselves. So there's a lot of times for countries where you work, still 12 hours in the day, but you take a 2-hour nap, 3-hour nap in the middle of the day. It isn't necessarily about lack of work. It's about how you work. And so that's something that will often be brought up in the critique of this stage. And then you take off. The idea of this is that countries that develop are the ones that got rid of those old institutions and traditions and values. Interestingly enough, that may be true, but we see really healthy countries that have developed, that have kind of mixed between this, maintaining large cultural values, traditional values in their countries, and not necessarily modernizing at a point. China would be one of those where it's a kind of a combination of the two. They begin to save and invest money in their future and get loans for development from high-income countries. This was, again, the after World War II model. Then the drive to technological maturity. This maturity is a stage where new investment in technology, where you would just invest in the highest level of technology. Now, where we've seen this happen a lot, for example, is India. India has invested in one of its most important technological advances that a lot of people don't think about, and that is the English language. And because they have taught English, and of course they were colonized, so that was a society that interacted with English speakers for quite a long time, they have become the call center of the world. So I don't know if you've ever had a tech call, I'm pretty sure you have, where the person that you're speaking to has a slight accent and they probably are from India. That drive to maturity for India to develop in those call centers, to train people with the technology of another language. Not only that, they often train people to answer for certain areas of the world, and those being trained are often taught about what's going on in that area of the world. So they may actually ask about basketball games, professional football games. They may ask about certain things, and they'd be very aware of what's going on in the area that they're assigned to for taking that call. So this is where that drive to technological maturity happened in some ways with India. It has other areas, obviously, that works, but this is our largest, we just see this sector where the whole world basically uses India for the call center for the 24 hours. Another thing that they took advantage of is that for the high-income countries of the US and Canada, that these countries are exactly opposite on the globe. So the people that are actually answering are in India, and it is daytime. And so they're fresh and ready for work. Whereas when we're calling at 12 o'clock at midnight for our cable going out or something crazy that we're trying to get figured out on our credit cards or whatever, they're in the middle of their day. So this is the kind of idea of the technological drive. It doesn't necessarily have to mean just machinery or, building up the industrialization of manufacturing, even though that is important. It can be other kinds of tech. And then finally, the idea of this drive is the high mass consumption stage, where your country is producing. There are people that are making money off the surplus value of their workers, and the companies are then able to reinvest, get higher tech, invest in the marketplace, and the benefits of that economic growth increase the standard of living. That's what was sold. And we often see this as a form of what we call neoliberalism, where that economic belief that the free market forces achieved by minimizing government restrictions on business provide the only route to economic growth. That's where we saw this idea develop, really, as well, because the idea was to create this marketplace with the nation states and to create as few restrictions so that countries could trade. Again, the countries that were developing did not start at the same level, and a lot of times did not have the same resources, government systems, even weather systems. This is something people do not take into account. We in the state of Kansas have tornadoes, but they tend to not hit us as directly as a tsunami or an earthquake. And there are certain parts of the world where that is part of everyday life. We know we have hurricanes, but we have hurricanes with infrastructures already in place to be able to deal with them. So this obviously has an ideal type, but it has to take into account all the factors that are going into that idea. I want you to watch the video on the global commodity chain. That's really important for us to look at. One, I think it's really excellent to teach us about how even our phone technology, when you pick up your phone, it has been made in many parts of the world and distributed here. And one thing that we often don't take into account are the very components that are mined. And tin is a large portion of that product. And there are many mines in very poor developing countries where people are working for cents to be able to make, meaning pennies, to be able to mine that and put their lives at risk. And then to think about the development and the different levels of the components, the screen, the whole idea of the packaging and all of that often comes from the West or mixed with China, depending. So please think about how each thing is not necessarily made in the same place. It often is about many different things coming together to make this one commodity, and that we've gotten so used to that. And at the very beginning of class, I think I told you to look at your tag on the back of your shirt, but if you haven't thought about that, your shirt's probably been on a world tour and you didn't even know it. You know, you say, oh, it's made in China. It's like, well, think about with a sociological imagination where that shirt was in China. A factory, the person that was holding it, the person that was making the material. These are parts of what we call the global commodity chain, and it's where all those production processes yield one product. Barbie, for example, her travel, if you think about her world, is usually parts of her from Saudi Arabia, parts of her from China, some parts of her from Taiwan, and some parts from Hong Kong. One Barbie doll can sometimes be made up of all those products, depending on if it's the hair, or if it's the plastic, or if it's the box. And it's all being sent into certain places. It's all not made in the same place. Let's turn to market-oriented theory. The strengths, well, this is what we've been working on, but the strengths of market-oriented theory, sorry. The market-oriented theory has some strengths, obviously the promotion of economic development, and it tries to open the borders to trade. There are some that want completely open borders. I've got many economist, sociological thinking friends that don't think we should have any tariffs anywhere, and that the open borders, however, when you bring in other ideas and social policy that people may or may not agree with, things like immigration, then should workers be able to freely move between countries easily so that we can trade as much as we want. And there's a lot of theory behind that. Market-oriented theories have some weaknesses. They overlook the ties between the rich and the poor, the blame of the work ethic, and not, it's usually seen as a particular kind of work ethic. And I often think, the uber rich, obviously they work, but as we said earlier in the last video and the last time, do they work 300 times more than their average worker? And the answer is no, they do not. And so if work is, you have to work to a certain level to get a certain amount of money or income, that works to a certain point, but there's a major weakness in thinking of that all the way. And then therefore thinking that countries are backward if they have any other way of doing their work, performing their work, and sometimes being able to be happier and healthier. It also ignores other forms of government. There's often democracy is the number one key for development, and there may be other forms of government that work. And for those people that have been under those forms of government for a long time, it is the social glue that keeps them together. It's the function. It functionally works for them, and that's something even the highest functionalist often thinks if it isn't broke, don't fix it. There are a lot of times that argument is made, and they fail to explain why some countries take off and others don't. Some people have the exact same stuff going for them, and they are very different in how their outcome comes. So if to grow one has to depend on other countries with more income, how does that promote a small government? That's one thing, is typically we see bureaucracies grow out of this kind of a system, and people then declare, hey, we have to have a small government. It's very difficult to convince people to do that. We get very invested in having larger powers, especially as we have more population and we see ourselves living amongst each other, not really aware of the systems that we're part of. That's where we start to see that organic system where we assume everything is taken care of and everything has always worked this way. And it hasn't. It's been constructed over time. So how does that promote a free market if there's a limit? Dependency theories. We're going to do a short bit on this. Conflict theorists often believe that we have created these systems where we're all dependent on each other, and that the economic development models, and this can be very easily argued, that this is true, that there's poverty and low-income countries are basically being exploited by the wealthy countries and the multinational corporations, and they're based in wealthy countries, and that this causes this level of dependency that shows very clear signs and indications that people in high-income countries don't really want the countries that are lower income to develop. It is an advantage to be able to charge less for labor and be able to not have the country develop so much that the costs go up, and then therefore the value of the worker goes up, and then therefore the prices have to go up for the consumers, and then the consumers complain to the companies, and the companies that are full of the owners, the CEOs, have to give up a house. These are the kind of things that constantly get looked at. One thing is this mode of performance is, it again doesn't explain everything. It's not like it's this wahaha kind of evil system that's constantly doing this. There are many people that work for great companies that are trying to make a difference, but they're stuck in a model that obviously does take advantage of lower labor costs and lower resource value, and there are major issues with this. But the thing about having this, very dichotomized, this is causing this, there's a lot that's in between that, overdevelopment and population growing and us creating this world trade. So it's not easy to get at. I would say this absolutely does happen. And I think there are certain companies that absolutely do act in this particular way. But not all companies do, not all nation states, and not all people are trying to promote this. And so one thing we have to recognize and be very aware of, just like we have with class and understanding the impact of slavery, is the impact of colonialism and the process whereby Western nations established rule over parts of the world from their home territories. And there's very decentralized types of government control where people didn't feel part of their own government. They didn't feel that national pride. They didn't feel the senses of the glue, because a lot of times they were fighting these colonizers that were taking advantage, but not always, keeping them from learning certain things. So there's certain parts of the development that happened because of colonialism. And some argue that we're still in that area of colonialism today. We just mask it differently, where we're not enslaving people or running governments from the top of the state. But there's a lot of influence and a lot of power and a lot of money and a lot of allies that are working together, where the people that are at the bottom, that are your average worker, they just can't get out of that system. It's larger powers that are running it. So this is something to keep in mind, and dependency theorists have a lot to say about this, and I think it's something for us to consider. There are strengths. It exposes the global inequalities through historical exploitation. Easy to do, can find it everywhere, in every part of every nation, everywhere. It's just there. But its weaknesses, it can't explain why some colonized countries economically grew and others didn't. I mean, there are some colonized countries, for example, China with Hong Kong. There's just so much growth there, and you see parts of colonization. And by the way, colonization isn't always Western. Japan in some ways colonized South Korea, and now there's major Western influence through the US, UK, Japan to South Korea. There's a clear path that there was exploitation going on there, but Koreans were able to turn that around with free trade and all kinds of things that highly recommend if you're interested in a country that's developed in its own kind of way. That's one country to look at. We'll look at it a little bit later in this lecture. World systems theory. This is the one that was Wallerstein that at the beginning I talked to you about. This theory emphasizes the interconnections among countries. This is my favorite theory for understanding what's going on, based on the expansion of the capitalist world economy. Basically, and there's a lot of criticism about this, but what basically Wallerstein is saying is the entire globe is reacting to the fact that capitalism is the largest system that is impacting all nation states, even if those nation states are not capitalist and are either communist, socialist, state-driven, dictatorships. All of them are still reacting to the larger system of capitalism. And if that were to change, then the economies or the nation states would be reacting to, let's say, state-driven models where the state is more involved, or to socialism. And socialism is the higher level that people are reacting to. But as the whole, that the largest system right now that's at play is still capitalism. And so as we look at these, we have three levels where the countries land, kind of like those middle income, high income, and low income. This is how Wallerstein would define it. The core countries, which is not based on income, it's based on influence and how these countries help or are the developers of the world and people are reacting to them. The peripheral countries that interact both with those who mostly are capitalist core countries and or social capitalists. And those semi-peripheral countries then are these countries. Well, actually, the peripheral is the first, so we'll look at it in just a second. But it's core countries, semi-peripheral countries, and then peripheral countries. And those peripherals are the ones that are the farthest out. Core countries are the most advanced countries which take advantage of and have the lion's share of profits in the world economic system. And so the US, China, South Korea, the UK, Germany, those types of countries. Semi-peripherals are countries that supply sources of labor and raw material to the core industrial countries in the world economics, but are not themselves fully industrialized. So they're kind of in this in-between. So the semi-peripheral is, if you look, at a core, the core is the little core, and then outside is the semi-peripheral, and then the peripheral is on the outside. If you're thinking about like the Earth with the core, think about this crust being the peripheral countries that have a marginal role in the world economy but are not themselves fully industrialized by society. The strengths of world system theory is it looks at the global economy as a whole and it analyzes the development between rich and poor countries based on a particular leading system. How is capitalism affecting the world and how are people reacting to that? The weakness is it doesn't fully explain the complexity of the world economic system. Even though other countries may be reacting with capitalism or to capitalism, they have intricate systems of trade, often with like-minded countries. And so those like-minded countries may have a whole nother system that we can't even see capitalism permeate. So that's something that is often criticized. It's also been criticized. It emphasizes nationalism and religious belief, meaning that, and I really believe this, that there is this high level of nationalism that people are trying to emphasize the success of their nation state. And as we globalize, we're starting to see that break down. People are interacting with each other across borders. They may have pride for their country, but that sense of their country's well-being isn't often people are willing to migrate more. And so this places a lot of emphasis on nation states, and our nation states are, there's, and Avon said this is a high migration period for Americans leaving the US to go work other places and settle. It's not just about people migrating to the US, there's a lot of migration going on outside the borders to go and live in other places because they see themselves having a better lifestyle there. So there's a lot of thought to put into play there. State-centered theories, these are the final ones that argue that appropriate government policies do not interfere with economic development, but rather play a key role in bringing it about. And so South Korea is like our poster child of this. It is a country that if it sees something that will make a big difference in their economic growth, they will do as little as they can to interfere with that. And yet, at the same time, it is surprising what kind of industries that is. Like 25 years ago, South Korea's music, nobody heard of it. Nobody thought about it. It was usually more 1970s style, kind of cheesy music. And then suddenly this thing, K-pop, started coming around, and bands, boy bands, girl bands, all that kind of stuff. And the country saw the potential as people reacted to that and would buy it. And so what happened is they actually started national schools for music. They did as much to pull out of the system any restrictions, and K-pop has become one of their top 2 commodities across the globe. Video games is another one. So it's important for us to know, this is what it suggests, is that for example, East Asian governments, these state-led economies often have improved greatly. And research from them at this time says sometimes aggressiveness is part of that. So they, for example, on the K-pop, aggressively went after that. And now if you go to Seoul, South Korea, you will see people that are being groomed to be the next K-pop stars. And it keeps labor costs low so that they can, get that going because they put a lot of investment into it. Frequently, it's sought to steer economies' development in desired directions. Some people would say if, for example, we steered our development for particular things that we wanted to produce. And this actually, I think, is what a lot of people are trying to move toward in the more conservative field, is a state-driven. It's not easy in the United States, and this is one reason why, is capitalism democracy has high levels placed on individualism. And we have a high individualistic spirit, meaning we do not like to be shoved into doing something we don't want to do. The East Asian countries have high communal societies. They are typically glued together as if the nation state has been a major part of their familiar life, and it is embedded. And as much as we want to say patriotism in the US is valued, it is highly valued in these Asian states. And there's no way we've developed individualists. You can't be an individualist and pull yourself up from your bootstraps because that's not expected in these countries. It is everybody pulls each other up with their bootstraps. And if it's to get around K-pop, we do it. And so that is the major difference. And it takes a long time. That was what the country was founded on, was individuals having the right to go after their own happiness, dreams, all that. That's what, at least the ideal type of what the U.S. has been built on, even though we know that's not true for people who are enslaved. That was not true for people who were convicts that were sent to the United States. I mean, there was lots of other explanations for that, but there was an individualist spirit. And these East Asian countries have state-driven systems that have always had a communal sense of a spirit. Often it's been heavily involved in social programs such as low-cost housing and universal education. You will see in most of these places a larger socialist understanding of how you get education or how you get your health care. State-centered theories, their strengths is the stress of the role of government in fostering economic growth, and it can explain with world systems theory how economies really work. And there's a lot of times people combine these two, saying there's a world system, and we also have to be aware of these state-driven systems that are working together. That often creates oligarchies at the top of the world system of the economic chain, but that's one of the things we're wading through and seeing how that's developing right now. And there's weaknesses, the view of the government of allies and elites. As allies, sometimes South Korea also had a huge group of people who were doing not so great businesses. There were kind of underground kind of industries that eventually they were also in place when South Korea developed to be able to create the manufacturing necessary that things came in to develop from Japan and take over things that Japan didn't want to do. And then suddenly they became part of the elite, and the government system worked with those elites, and that can cause a lot of corruption. And that's one thing that is often criticized. So looking at these theories again, market-oriented theories recommend the adoption of modern capitalist institutions, and they promote economic development. Dependency says it emphasizes how wealthy nations exploit the poor ones. World systems analyzes the governments as a whole, looking at the complex web of the political economic relationships that influence development of inequality between the poor and the rich and the elite. And the theory of global commodity change finds itself within that as their activities work. So I'd say that commodity systems really goes along with the world systems theory. And then the state-centered theories analyzes the world economy based on looking how governments directly impact what they're making and putting all they can into taking restrictions out of the development of those products so that it can go on the global market, and then to be able to develop those goods in a way that is unique to that place and often doesn't have much competition. Understanding global inequality requires a perspective of viewing entire groups of people that we currently deem nation states. Some argue out there in the sociological world that nation states might be heading a different direction in the next 200 years, like really making some changes as to what it looks like on the global system. I don't know if we're going to see that by the time we die, but as globalization happens, we definitely see the reaction to that going on right now. Excuse me, that's the end. I hope that if you have any questions, once again, 913-553-0267. I hope you have a great week. I'll be extending this time for the response on this lecture. Excuse me, and have a great week. Bye-bye.